Okay, everybody, hello, and a huge welcome back. So, we are now wrapping things up when it comes to Chris and his mental health care, or rather, Chris and his mental health more in a very general sort of way. There's an awful lot more to this than just the Chris Ann articles, to be said, because, well, unfortunately, because of how much we know of Chris, it's one of those things you just sort of you roll with the punches a little bit. And today, we wrap up by talking about Chris and reality. Now, here's something to the outside, to any casual observer, here's something you do have to keep in mind, is that sometimes, and from how I've noticed things, Chris's grasp on reality is based on one of two things. The first, and probably the most damning thing I've said on this channel for a very long time, is that Chris can absolutely tap his balls and say, you know what, I know perfectly well what the situation is, so therefore I've actually got to do something about it. But sometimes Chris just decides not to do it. So I actually do thoroughly believe Chris absolutely knows fine well the difference between what the right and the wrong thing is to do. It's probably also helped that there's been a lot of people over the years who've exemplified this, from, well, myself, Dylan Thomas, Gibby, Gino Samuel. It would appear that Gino Samuel is actually the one that Chris actually listens to, because unlike myself or any of the others, all those other guys, Gino's reach has been, well, probably a lot more successful. But then again, I've never once tried to say that this should be used, well, like I said, as a substitute for, professional advice or anything attributed to like an actual mental welfare check, stuff like that. So that's one thing. The second thing when it comes to Chris's grasp on reality is that, well, based on certain key aspects that we've talked about with Chris before, including the things we'll be touching upon in this article, surprisingly enough, you can sort of see why. There are things about this that do make Chris's situation, in terms of, well, how he views the world, easier to understand. But unfortunately for Chris, and for Chris, not me, the way he copes with situations is, well, they're more coping mechanisms. They're not solving problems. So the only way for Chris to actually solve his problems is, ironically, as far as Chris puts it, is to ignore it as much as possible. Now, this is more of a thing pre-arrest in 2021, but the difference between Chris pre and post-arrest is also probably going to play a little bit of a stronger factor into how Chris sort of interprets reality, or rather, at least on the surface. And when we get to talking about Chris post-arrest, we will have a lot more room to discuss, well, whether or not Chris legitimately has had a stronger grip on reality than at any other point in his life, or whether this is all, again, just played for the camera, played for attention, or whether or not this is in the vice-like grip of Flutter's surprisingly smallish claws, or maybe it's part of the terms of his release, or something like that. But let's get started. This is going to be long enough as it is, and there's a lot to go over. First of all, Chris, December 2016, in a rare moment of self-awareness, breaking away from his habit of escapism. You can only escape in your mental depths and recluse for so long before you are pulled back to reality, and too many things leave you feeling like you get little peace at home. Unfortunately for Chris, and you probably will hear me say this quite a number of times, he should have taken his own advice then. But let's roll, shall we? Reality is a concept that Chris desperately tries to avoid acknowledging, instead retreating to the comfort of his imaginary world and hoping that reality will eventually bend to his whims. Many people with autism struggle to distinguish between reality and fantasy, but most make an effort to reduce the impact on their lives. Chris, on the other hand, embraces his realm of fantasy, especially as escapism from stress, life's responsibilities, and his bleak future, trapping himself in a feedback loop whereby his real-world life and issues are further neglected, while his devotion to his fantasies gets stronger. Notably, Chris believes that Quickville and his imaginary friends are real. Whether Chris still believes this, however, is something, well, that is questionable. But I say still believes in it because Chris doesn't really talk about it. It's the same reason why Chris doesn't really bring up the dimensional merge post-arrest either. So, what do you suppose, guys? Do you think that means that Chris just decides to just drop it? Or just because Chris doesn't talk about it, it doesn't mean to say it's not on his mind? What does Chris genuinely think post-arrest? Maybe it would be a stronger question. Chris has been spotted conversing, interacting, and dancing with them on many occasions, and even believes that he is married to imaginary people. Chris also holds many delusions of grandeur, from believing he has the power to curse people to thinking he has psychic powers, and even believing he is a goddess with the power to unite entire dimensions, and that this dimensional merge would make him rich and bring his fictional characters and those of others to life. Chris's perception of reality has been on a downward spiral for most of his life, due to a lifetime of being coddled by his parents, following the death of his father in 2011, and amid the increasing infirmity of his mother. Chris was forced into shouldering more responsibilities that he was mentally ill-equipped to bear, and consequently he invested more heavily in magical beliefs as solutions to the problems presented by reality. In 2017, the idea guys, trolls who utilized role-playing techniques as Chris's imaginary friends, further exasperated Chris's grasp of reality, giving validation to his fantasies and encouraging him to stay rooted in his fantasy world, a trend continued at present day by waves of enablers. Chris maintains his beliefs that even in the face of mental health professionals for 9 months between the summer of 2018 and the spring of 2019, he was required to see a psychiatrist and therapy group at Region 10 and told them of his beliefs of his imaginary friends and multiple dimensions, to which their reaction was to simply hand-wave him through their program. This, again, I do question maybe the validity of how effective these sessions must have been, or whether or not this was more just as a requirement so that Chris wouldn't... So, did Chris, just play ball with these people just so Chris could avoid jail time? Or whether or not this was legitimately something that maybe they should have taken more seriously, I will leave up to you to decide. I don't work for Region 10, for example, so that's something that somebody else would have to give me a lecture on. Okay, causes of Chris's poor grip on reality. Parental enabling. Although autism is one major factor, his parents contributed a lot towards Chris's warped perception of anyone or anything that antagonizes him. Bob and Barbara regularly fed Chris conciliatory platitudes about how he was mistreated out of jealousy and that special rules exist for the benefit of autistic people. Unfortunately, Chris... Well, listen, I'm going to just break the ice right now, and listen, I know this is probably going to be another very controversial thing for me to say, but unfortunately, extra benefit for autistic people doesn't exist. I wish it did sometimes, but unfortunately it doesn't. You want to know why there is no extra benefits for autistic people? Well, because unfortunately, let me put it to you guys like this. Maybe in school, maybe in the education system, that would be one thing, but here's the thing. Extra benefits for autistic people is not a thing that actually happens in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of crime, nor is it a thing that actually increases a person's lifespan by another 5 years. In the real world, the thing that is not C197, you have things that happen to people, and it doesn't really seem to matter in the eyes of some people whether they are autistic, whether they have Down syndrome, whether they have iridocyclitis, whether they have osteoporosis, crippling depression, whether they are handicapped and can never walk again, whether they were beaten as a child by their parents so severely that they can't form any sort of meaningful relationship. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't, because guess what? Life can sometimes be a very unfair and a very cruel place. And this is just for people who don't live in third world countries where you have to wonder where the next drop of water will be coming from. Stuff like that. That's the sort of thing. Now listen, when one is overworked and completely enamored by the thoughts of stress, it is actually a very good cure for self-pity to be reminded of the people who are homeless, people who have no roofs over their head, the people who undergo the most inhumane levels of torture and trafficking. You get what I'm saying, is that if you think Chris has got it bad, well, let me tell you something, there's a lot more people that have it worse, and they exist in reality as well, as much as Chris. The platitudes cemented Chris's all-pervasive sense of entitlement, as well as his indiscriminate belief that anything bad that happened to him was a conspiracy, whether or not it was caused by his stupidity or stubbornness. Psychological problems. The only known formal diagnoses of Chris are autism, dating from when he was 5 or 6 years old, and gender dysphoria, officially diagnosed in 2016. However, his behavior in adulthood suggests he has undiagnosed issues. Chris exhibits signs of maladaptive daydreaming, a psychological disorder comprised, of vivid daydreams and excessive fantasies that can interfere with socializing or even replace it altogether. This behavior is observed in Chris with his imaginary friends at Quickville. The dimensional merge, and especially the polyamorous marriage, maladaptive daydreaming is also associated with pacing and musical stimulation. Eyewitness accounts of Chris, such as The Tale of the Crazy Pacer, mention these behaviors in him. Chris also stated that music from his phone is his method for meditation. Peter Pan syndrome is a pop psychological term used to describe those who are immature and refuse to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. Chris has demonstrated this with his refusal to seek work, instead begging for money or ignoring his debt payments to afford more toys. An eyewitness to one of Chris's debt hearings noted that Chris was trying hard to revert to childhood, based on how he made childish noises during his time in the courtroom and talked back to his mother in a childlike voice. The dimensional merge represents Chris's ultimate desire to hide from adult responsibilities, as he believes it will grant his wildest power fantasies and enable him to continue living like a child. Chris's devotion to rejecting adult life has warped his perception of reality, as he spends all of his free time playing make-believe as if it were a religion. A common theory since the dimensional merge saga unfolded is that Chris may have schizophrenia, based on his rantings about his imaginary world seeming as if he cannot distinguish between reality and fantasy. However, a closer look at Chris's rambling shows that he is capable of discerning the difference, but couches in the belief of different dimensions to preserve his escapist fantasies. Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, is that sometimes I think Chris just chooses not to conform to what is real and what isn't, and it's more just so that Chris can preserve his own whimsical belief that things will be okay and that things do not look so bleak given the situation, which may also suggest that well, I was going to make a comment about, Chris's hoarding with video games and toys, but at this point, does it really even serve any function at all, apart from it's just a thing it's more of a hoarding issue, which then again, hoarding could also be a systematic of like Peter Pan syndrome of failing to let go, so the only thing to do is to hold on even more. Perhaps. Unlike a schizophrenic, however, Chris will distinguish between reality, or as he calls it, 1218, and his fantasy domain named C197. Damn, Dimension 1218's reality limits and shit. Chris's reaction when reality's dimension and his fantasy dimension did not merge as predicted. A prime example of him being able to differentiate reality from his escapist fantasies. Also, Chris, though not fully doable on the 1218 side of the dimensional curtain yet, I am able to draw up a water to wine conversion and vice versa. Chris showing he is aware and he doesn't have superpowers in reality. I never would have guessed. Also, unlike a schizophrenic, Chris's fantasies do not involve paranoia or hallucinations and are entirely self-serving. While Chris has made statements implying he is hallucinating, such as when he insists he can see or interact with his imaginary friends, he often omits that he uses techniques such as meditation or astral projection. Read simple imagination, another indicator that his issue is maladaptive daydreaming. I've had to commute to here, Dimension C197, via astral projection. The tough part is having to leave my body behind in 1218. Oh, but very... I just knocked my mic there. Oh, but very soon I shall finally be able to bring my body here to C197. Chris giving a rare explanation on how he delves into his fantasy world. Whether it's just dropping everything and pretending to actually be somewhere else, perhaps. That's actually quite tragic, wanting to be just anywhere else. Chris's behaviour and beliefs, however, align at least somewhat with schizotypal personality disorder, which is thought to exist on a spectrum with schizophrenia. Him matching at least 6 of the 9 diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. 1. Ideas of reference, believing that certain generally innocuous events hold special meaning or messages for oneself. 2. Strange beliefs or magical thinking that influences behavior and is inconsistent with subcultural norms. 3. Abnormal perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. 4. Suspiciousness or paranoid ideation. 5. Strange behavior or appearance. 6. Excessive social anxiety that does not diminish with familiarity and tends to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about self. Whilst Chris was largely comfortable around his paid-for companions during high school, his interaction with both the fairer sex and pickle bearers have since been riddled with paranoid fears and delusions. The last 3 symptoms, however, namely strange thinking and speech, lack of close friends, and inappropriate or constricted affect, whilst also present in Chris, can be almost exclusively attributed to his autism. Much like his narcissism, also schizotypal individuals generally do not develop the grandiose delusions he has developed over the years and are generally reclusive. So further digging than internet armchair analysis is required, which Chris, of course, will likely never receive, thanks to his adamant refusal to seek out help voluntarily or benefit from professional help that is forced upon him. Now, one might argue, based on the reading of that last one, is that whether or not help being forced upon Chris actually realistically helps matters, because one could turn around and say the resulting action of why Chris had to go to Region 10 following a trespassing case at the Fashion Square Mall in 2018. Chris had to go to Region 10 or face possible jail time. But considering that was just, it was more like a get out of jail free card, and the only thing that really resulted in is that Chris basically blasting a psychiatrist because they told Chris to bring out traumatic experiences from Chris's own childhood, and not as insofar as Chris was concerned, not to necessarily make him feel better or even possibly make him come to terms with it, but rather just as a means of just getting it out there, possibly for something to talk about, or at least something to demonstrate to the psychologists that there is something involved in it. This is from Chris's perspective, by the way, but considering what it's resulted in like less than probably 10 weeks since he last had his therapy session, let alone in 2 years, even to this day, we'll wait and see. Mind you, actually, well, when I say even to the present day, like I said before, sometimes I get the impression Chris will legitimately know fine well what the right and wrong thing is to do, but sometimes Chris just decides not to do any of it. Lack of grounding in the real world. Chris's lack of purpose, combined with his enormous ego, further fuels his disconnection from reality, compelling him to instead seek out the purpose with make-believe, such as being the mayor of Quickville and being the goddess CPU Blueheart. Since the government provides for him with the monthly tugboat, well, I would say US taxpayers provide him with that. It's just it's basically it's money from one pocket that goes into another that also finally ends up in Chris's. Whatever. Along with money from financial enablers, same theory really, and his parents always provide a roof over his head. Chris has never had an incentive to get a job. Without the structure that a job, even a minimum wage or volunteer position would impart to him, Chris is instead free to wallow in his fantasies. Chris's hobbies are mostly limited to Netflix, video games, YouTube, and Twitter. Despite supposedly having a calling for art, he rarely draws like he used to. While video games can stimulate the brain, his hobbies leave little room for creativity or substantial self-improvement. Yeah, part of it almost feels like it's like one of those videos where it says how to ruin your 20s in like 95 seconds. And a lot of it seems to revolve around the idea that such a huge problem for men in their earlier years, or women, is enforced idleness. The idea that there's nothing to actually do because A, there's either not enough hours in the day, because people are more like are condemning themselves with work, with studying and stuff like that. So whether people, I think it tries to impose the idea that I think even just like how perhaps a cook will not cook for pleasure or cook to entertain himself. That's kind of like how, but I think even that's too much for Chris. Chris is, when it comes to Chris and his art, Chris does not really draw for pleasure or draw even as a hobby. Chris draws and then says, good job, print, and out it goes. And it's the sort of thing that's even felt when you get into things like Solitude issue 11. But we'll discuss Chris and his art later and stuff like that. But let's keep going. Even a simple hobby like photography would be a big step up from Chris's current avocations. Chris rarely leaves his room, instead preferring to daydream for 3 to 6 hours per day. When he does socialize, it is mainly on his terms, role-playing with enablers who keep him invested in his fantasies, or appearing at conventions with fans who treat him as a celebrity. Do you know what a celebrity is? As for what I do while awake, on the recent I get up, take my meds, meditate while playing Tetris 99, to at least take on the daily tasks for the game. Most days I go out on errand or simple walking. Away during the time at home, I tend to binge a show, do some drawing or creative work, namely the TSSF cards and the comic pages. Now again, I'm not going to start getting into discussions about you know, whether this is like a good way to spend your days or whether or not it's like worse or anything like that. But taking one look at this, it feels as though there isn't like anything. A lot of it seems to be the sort of things that Chris chooses to do, and nothing about this reads as Chris has to do. Like, some people would say, I get up, I have a shower, I have breakfast, I go to work, I have lunch at 12:30, I resume work at 1:30. Sometimes it's a bit hard to stay awake because sometimes like from like 1:30 till 3:00 it's quite quiet in the office. Quitting time is at 5:00. I usually get home by about 6 or maybe even 6:30, depending on the traffic. I have dinner with my family. I relax, and maybe I'll go to the gym. Maybe I'll go see friends. Maybe I'll do stuff like that. Whatever I can actually fit into my day. I finally go to bed. Now, you could once again, if to compare the two, you could say, well, why Chris has never at any point. I mean, what is technically stopping Chris from like improving his art or trying to do something to legitimately improve his mind? Because, well, for all this quote-unquote meditation, it just seems to be something to tack on to the idea that, well, all Chris is just doing is playing Tetris 99. But with that being added, what exactly what is technically stopping Chris from actually like taking the time out to improve like his drawing? Because let's think about this, guys. Chris has pretty much been on the old rock and roll since at least 2001, something like that. That's nearly 24 years. And you could hardly say, you know, Chris has legitimately, like, he has pretty much all the leisure in the world. So why on earth Chris does not actually take the time out to actually improve his studies? Because to do that, you actually sort of need to have a structure, an environment in which you can actually devote time to doing something where you can come away saying, you know what, that was good because I actually got a lot of things done during the day. It's why honestly, I've never bought into the idea that actually working from home is actually the greatest idea in the world. Because why? Because it's too familiar and it's too comfortable, and it's too easy. And it's the sort of thing that can lead to ideas of, you know, stagnation. And because why leave the comfort of your own home to go work to do the work to just do the same thing elsewhere when you could be comfortable in your own environment? And well, how much it all plays into how much you can do at home as compared to do outside. But then again, that's also probably one of the things why they try and tell you to do like well in school, or to at least develop a skill and stuff like that. But then again, this is one of those things where there is an entire like essays worth of things to talk about when it comes to like the actual educational system, because there's too many things to be said about whether or not like trying to test somebody as young as 16 about, you know, if they're going to do well for the rest of their lives. People say, well, I think a lot of people go very back and forth on stuff like that, but let's keep going. Escapist fantasies. Chris embraces his fantasies as escapism, overindulging in them to the point that his interest in them has largely eclipsed his real-world life. When his childlike lifestyle conflicts with his responsibilities associated with being an adult, Chris retreats to his fantasy realm to cope. This habit became especially prevalent in the years following the September 2011 death of his father, after which Chris found himself thrust into the world of adult responsibilities, as he had to do tasks such as pay his bills and help take care of his mother and pets. Chris was 29 years old when his father passed away. While most people would be accustomed to dealing with responsibilities by that age, Chris was unprepared for the burden since his parents had sheltered him up to that point. For example, until he died, his father had managed Chris's bank account due to his fiscal irresponsibility. When my father was alive, I had more freedom. Now that he has passed, I lost a lot of freedom and remained to take after the tasks he had left behind. You can only escape in your mental depths and recluse for so long before you are pulled back to reality, and too many things leave you feeling like you get little peace at home. Chris, but then again, considering the quote-unquote peace in the Chandler household, from the hoarding situation to trying to look after pets that we know fine well Chris and his mother were completely incapable of handling. And, well, yeah, no wonder it'd probably be... no wonder it's probably hard to find peace. But then again, do something about it then. You kind of, again, you go back and forth a little bit about, well, if Chris really was that incapable of looking after animals, let alone himself, then why would they go through with the idea of getting them in the first place? Chris occasionally whined on social media about his position in having to help take care of his mother and pets, his statements gradually revealing more of his retreat into escapist fantasies. In September 2012, he complained, "Everybody else gets to go out and have a good time. I am stuck caregiving my mother and our dogs, and it is very stressful on me." In January 2013, Chris was hoping for his sweetheart to rescue him from his life. "I need my sweetheart to make me happy. My heart hurts literally from my depression and loneliness. Serving my mother is not a final purpose to me, and my social life is very slim. I feel like I lack direction in my life as well." By the summer of 2017, Chris was immersed in his escapism to the point that he was dancing with Magi-chan, one of his imaginary friends at BronyCon, in October of that year. From his list of reasons for refusing to get a job, half involved his devotion to his fantasies. "I have a ton and S-load of responsibilities and worries here at home, caretaking my mother, dogs, cats, and to my own passion of my electric hedgehog Pokemon family, my city of Quickville, my own only me psychic connection to my family and friends there, in that dimension, so I'll be darned if I do not already have enough on my plate." Chris's desire to be rescued from reality left him desperate for his fantasies to be validated. His mentality similar to people willing to join cults. This led Chris to being exploited by a number of trolls, with the most infamous being the Idea Guys. Chris would only continue to retreat further and further into this elaborate alternative reality bric-a-brac that he had constructed in his own mind. While under arrest for blankety blank his elderly mother, Chris chose to ignore the seriousness of the situation that he was now involved in and gave a long spiel to the responding police officers about Sonichu, his status as a supreme goddess and the dimensional merge, as Chris sat in Central Virginia Regional Jail awaiting legal proceedings. He has now chosen to believe that he is also the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Though, as of March 2025, Chris seems to have, well, reclined back on this somewhat. Not 100%, but Chris is a lot less, well, preachy about it. In fact, speaking of Jesus Christ, tomorrow, ironically, is Ash Wednesday. I might even go to church tomorrow night, specifically for it. Cult of the Idea Guys. I feel need to also thank them for adding more connection between our sister dimension and I. Chris on the Idea Guys retaining his cultist mentality several months after they had been ousted, and clearly the damage had already been done. On the 20th of October 2017, Joshua Wise was the first of a duo that would later be dubbed the Idea Guys, contacted Chris. Initially as an experiment to gauge Chris's gullibility, Wise began a plot to manipulate Chris into believing that Wise had made it into Quickville's dimension. Drawing from his experience in role-playing communities and borrowing lore from the video game/anime series Hyperdimension Neptunia, Wise crafted an elaborate narrative that included edited image graphics, doctored audio clips such as Red Forest, and role-playing as Chris's imaginary friends. Chris, by this point in his life, desperate for his fantasies to be validated, eagerly accepted Wise's claims. Just like that, ironically. The association between Wise and Chris morphed into cult leader and devotee follower. Wise, taking advantage of Chris's desire for validation, brainwashed his beliefs on Quickville and his imaginary friends, such as by claiming Quickville to be occupied by Nazis, that Rose Chu is a transgender woman, and that Chris is married to imaginary friends, with Chris accepting it as fact. At some point, the second idea guy, Stephen Boyd, joined Wise. Together, the two exploited their influence over Chris and had him make false statements for blackmail purposes and conned Chris into giving them thousands of dollars under threats that they would destroy Quickville and release the blackmail material if he failed to comply. Their activities caught the attention of people in Chris's inner circle, who formed a group later termed the Guard Dogs to counteract the idea guys and remove them from power. However, even after the ousting, and though the Guard Dogs tried to encourage him to seek therapy at Region 10, Chris still retained most of the beliefs that the idea guys had brainwashed into him over the 6 months that they were in power. God Dog Marvin explained Chris's perspective. Reality is a malleable concept to Chris. To Chris, that these losers were pretending to be imaginary characters doesn't mean they didn't unwittingly connect with their counterparts in the other dimension or whatever. So yeah, he thinks Wise and Boyd were assholes who stumbled upon some magic or some shit. Chris is mostly mad about money first and being made to embarrass himself second. In regards to why he still maintains a lot of their canon, it's because Chris is too invested in his imaginary world to give up on it so easily. I think after Wise and Boyd were outed, he felt really uncomfortable about retconning most of their changes. Because if he retcons the past 6 months, then fuck, why can't he retcon all of it? That would make him feel really uneasy about the possible reality of his imaginary world. That reality is most important to him. Because presumably it is literally the only thing Chris has 100% control over. The post-Idea Guys era ignited a wave of enablers who sought to use the Idea Guys tactics to worm their way into Chris's life. For a few months, the Guard Dogs attempted to protect Chris by screening messages for him. However, given Chris's refusal to address his psychological weakness and willingness to find others to play make-believe with, the enablers eventually broke past their defenses, leading to the Guard Dogs washing their hands of Chris. The TT Squad in the fall of 2018, MKR Night V in the winter of 2019, Jacob Sockness in the summer of 2019, and a myriad of other enablers took turns role-playing with Chris and enabling his fantasies in exchange for his attention. In addition, using lore brute forced into his head by the Idea Guys, Chris declared himself to be a goddess, CPU Blueheart, and began to preach about the dimensional merge, further intensifying the cult vibes of his beliefs. Consequences. Beyond making a fool of himself, Chris's poor grasp of reality has compelled him to fall for con men exploiting his beliefs and cause damage to his home. That word right there, which I will not be saying, but you can probably say it for yourself, yeah. Late onset gender dysphoria is a psychological disorder describing those who identify with another gender over their own, and can present with the desire to be rid of their primary sex characteristics and prefer those of the other gender. Like with everything else in life, Chris sought out magical thinking to treat his gender dysphoria. In March of 2016, he discovered subliminal frequency hypnosis, a collection of music tracks on YouTube claiming to, among other things, magically grant larger breasts and transform a penis into a vagina. Chris's confirmation bias over his breasts increasing, crediting it to the mysticism instead of his gynecomastia and poor measuring of his chest, led him to believe that the claims made by the channel were true. He pursued the penis-vagina transformation and began to prod his taint while under the impression there was a vagina under there. Though the subliminal channel claimed the transformation would take 6 months, Chris eventually lost patience. And in July of 2016, following drinking some alcohol, he grabbed a knife and made a blankety-blank taint wound in an effort to free his vagina. Do you guys feel a little bit sick? Yeah, well, it never stops the second you read it the first time. Chris's devotion to the delusion was so potent that he initially resisted efforts by concerned fans to pressure him into going to the hospital. Goodness knows what happens if Chris held out and was still refusing to go, though he eventually wore down and admitted it was a wound and obeyed treatment instructions. And after that, Chris tried to avoid the subject online. Mostly. Con artists. While Chris has long been taken advantage of by trolls, the tactics and goals from the likes of the Idea Guys and Jacob Sockness surpassed the typical catfishing for content. The Idea Guys gradually built up a strong psychological hold over Chris by affirming his fantasies and playing along with them, to the point where Chris had full faith in anything they told him. They then used their influence to con Chris out of $6,000 by threatening to blow up Quickville with a moon laser if he failed to comply, manipulate him into punching his mother, and had him make videos slapping himself in the face and evacuating all over the floor. Things became even darker when the Idea Guys threatened to falsely report Chris as a P-word to the FBI if he stopped supplying them with vast sums of money, consoles, and games, thus deepening the financial crisis. Jacob Sockness, following the example set by the Idea Guys, nearly succeeded in manipulating Chris into a sexual relationship, holding the dimensional merge over his head and faking a conversation with Chris's imaginary friend to convince him that they should meet and consider marriage. Though both the Idea Guys and Sockness were eventually ousted by people countering their role-playing with their own, Chris has always failed to learn and continues to leave the gates to his imaginary realm open to anyone who will validate his fantasies further. Property damage. My hands have punched that wall more than once in the past, yes, but it was part of the sequence of events at the time in practice of physically breaking the threads of the Iron Curtain veil. What does this mean? Well, as of July 2021, almost an entire month before he was arrested, a bathroom in the Chandler home has damaged the drywall from being punched in. Chris stated that he had punched the wall in order to physically break the Iron Curtain, his term for a dimensional barrier between reality and fantasy dimension C197. Fantasy and fiction. You think that comic character wouldn't have its own thoughts and feelings? Chris's question to Alec Benson-Leary. No, was Alex's responses, and Chris's response was, "You are naive." And this was as far back as the almost very early 2010 this was, so maybe it was, so maybe going back to what I said at the very beginning, maybe my theories weren't they didn't have any weight at all, or maybe Chris really was just somebody who really genuinely believed this, or maybe there was a misinterpretation here or something like that. I don't know. By the time the internet first discovered him, circa 2007, Chris already held beliefs that Quickville and his imaginary friends were real, and that he had the power to curse people. Since then, as a maladaptive coping mechanism for his real-world life crumbling around him, Chris gradually took on larger-scale fantasies such as parallel dimensions. Quickville. Quickville is Chris's original vision of an imaginary and idyllic fantasy world, where everything is built around his comfort and convenience, and where he enjoys great power with scant responsibility. Chris believes that Quickville is real and uses the city as a way to escape from a world that does not give Chris what he wants at all times. Quickville was originally an ill-filled city within the state of Virginia, but it became part of the larger C-197 dimension when Chris started toying with the dimensional merge. All of Chris's characters are aware that Chris is the creator of their reality. Sonichu and Rosechu both refer to him as Father, in much the same way as a Christian might consider God to be his or her creator. It is unknown if the comic exists in the universe of Quickville. That's actually a really interesting idea. Chris believes his characters possesses the free will to make their own decisions, and that he is not responsible for their actions. This is how various events, both major and minor, such as Sonichu and Rosechu's wedding, the birth of their children, Kel's romance with Nate Cirque, and even Bubbles and Blake's wedding, are said to actually happen off-screen, instead of just being a spur-of-the-moment throwaway plot elements that Chris is too lazy to depict, even through walls of text. Without prior explanation, Chris made a spoiler in his own comic that Magi-chan will eventually get together with Sylvana, implying that, in Chris's head, this has already happened. It is Slaweel Ryan, not Chris, who apologizes for slandering Mary Lee Walsh. Chris once justified his refusal to write Simona out of the comic by saying that she would not want to leave Quickville, and that she and Wilde would fight for her right to stay. What a load of bollocks is probably what the judge would say if that legitimately ever made it to court. But yeah, that was actually pretty much a large part of the basis for the entire Asperju saga, as it turned out, was because of Simona. Oh, and also because Chris was angry that cactus ads and gay rights ads were appearing on the Quickie. Yeah, true story. Chris considers everything drawn, written, or even said about Quickville to be canonical if he's the one stating it, regardless of contradictions, and feels it necessary to explain away undesirable changes to Quickville made as a result of outside influences, for example Billy Mays as the true mayor of Quickville. The fact that he needs to explain this in his comic pages shows that he assumes everyone else shares this belief as well. Despite considering his own judgment infallible as applied to his own work, he forces others to accept the corrections he has made to theirs. When the Asperpedia 4 used systematic trolling to make Chris kill off the character Simona, Chris viewed it as a deliberate attack on his fantasy world, Quickville, which had always been Chris's way of retreating from the real world, had been infiliated by outside forces, and was no longer impenetrable. So this is likely why Chris put the comic on hiatus, to stop outside forces from causing any more damage. You know what, considering, Chris's backstory and stuff like that, and considering, the inception of things that came into the comic, it's actually kind of surprising that Chris really is this weak to thinking that that is the sort of thing that, to use that as an excuse as to why Chris put a pause on the actual production of the comics. Yeah. No kidding. Chris's beliefs are such that he claims to hold the distinction of mayor of Quickville in real life. He only admits that Quickville is not real when he intends to pacify others he sees as too slow in the mind to comprehend this idea. He most likely defends this belief because he has accomplished and produced virtually nothing worthwhile in his entire life. And he likes to pretend that he has made a positive impact on something, if only on a metaphysical level. In his opinion, anyone who does not accept his world view is naive. On the 23rd of July 2017, Chris responded to his true and loyal fan base, who wondered why Chris wouldn't reboot his comics. As a response, Chris explained that if he were to reboot his comics, that would mean that history in the canon would have to start all over again. Well, not necessarily. Just draw up just call it something like Sonichu 2, and just have it so it's like an alternative starting point. Nothing like, because here's the thing, Chris is under the impression that if you did a thing like that, then it means that you would have to start the story all over again. Not necessarily, just improve on what has come before. You already have the basis for what you wanted, in theory, at least according to Chris. And bear in mind, considering that, well, Chris in later years has resorted to tracing a lot of material to like formulate new stories for his comics, it's not exactly as if Chris wouldn't be beyond that idea, or even take it as an opportunity to improve your artwork in some respect. Besides, as much as Chris sometimes, if it were up to me, as much as I personally would have, unfortunately, guess what? The Sonichu comics are not actually going anywhere anytime soon, so why not just start afresh? But again, whether you want to say this is too much for Chris to think about, I will leave up to your imagination. Essentially, he thinks that if he pulls the plug on the Sonichu franchise and reboot it, that would mean all of his characters would die, and they would somehow reincarnate into their newer, upgraded versions. I believe in the alternate dimensions where each set or all our animated characters reside and live their lives, and continues growing long after their series is finished, or stay kids, whatever. This is Chris to Doopy Do-Over, by the way. I don't know if Doopy Do-Over ever made a response to this. I'm pretty sure she didn't, but there you are. Dimensions. The moment I brought up the multiverse, he listened. The original idea guy on how he got Chris's attention. Chris's belief in alternative dimensions enables him to disconnect from the poor and mundane life he currently resides in, and to shift the responsibility over personality flaws to an alternative Chris. It gives him solace to believe that he, or other versions of himself, exist in other places where he is content, successful, and surrounded by characters and people who love him. The idea guys exploited Chris's nascent beliefs and desires on other dimensions and further shaped them as part of their cult-like grip over his beliefs. The dimensional merge is Chris's ultimate escapist fantasy, enabling him to think he is powerful and wealthy, with real friends and a happy marriage, all just waiting for him on the other side of the dimensional curtain. A concept originally created by the idea guys and later expanded on by Chris with the help of fantasy enablers. The merge is his hope that the sister dimensions 1218 and C197 will unify with him, overseeing the merge in his role as the goddess CPU Blueheart. The dimension 1218, sometimes referred to as 1218, is the dimension of reality. The dimension C197 is the designation for Chris's imaginary world, which contains all of his favourite fictional characters and OCs. The merge was originally scheduled to complete by the end of 2018, leaving behind a universe known as 1C-211987, with elements of both sister dimensions, and enable Chris to realise his dream of hanging out with Sonichu and pals. Imaginary friends. And one day, very soon, my family and I will be able to show ourselves to you all. Then you will be taking back your own schizo labels. Harumph. Chris vowing that he will see his characters in the flesh. Also Chris, When I look into the eyes of an original or fictional character, I do not see fiction at all. I see a full living being and individual. I see a friend or lover in a few cases. Well, that could turn pretty creepy, that couldn't it? Chris describing how he sees his characters as real. And careful there, Mr. Osterman. You don't want to be looking at ponies in that sort of way. And yeah, they already get the idea. Oh, by the way, guys, just a brief little thing before we go on. You know what, for those who haven't heard me bring up Mr. Osterman before, well, apparently there was a guy. Osterman is not his real name, by the way, but it was a name that he had to have changed to. I don't even know if Osterman was what he got changed to, but apparently this was a guy who got banned from every stables in England because, well, he was getting his leg over at a horse's expense. It was apparently several horses as well, as it turned out. It was near way. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, like I said, yeah, he was bumming horses. There is literally nothing I could say that can make that sound any less disgusting. And well, I think he must have been kicked by one in the stomach as well, because he was like banana shaped and everything. But yeah, I think that's just, yeah. Are you glad I brought that up? I hope you are, because yeah, who else has lasted this long into the video? Anyway, moving on. In addition to Quickville, Chris's belief in imaginary friends is another major element of escapism, a mix of maladaptive coping and daydreaming. Chris believes that his characters actually exist in both C-197 and 1218, and that he can communicate with them via meditation sessions. In reality, conflating his inner monologue with imagined visions and voices of his fictional friends. There are many instances of Chris trying to interact with his imaginary friends over the years, becoming more prevalent over time as his desire for escapism intensifies. Examples include his confrontation with Mary Lee Walsh in 2004, his imaginary dance partner at the 2017 BronyCon Gala, and social media messages near the end of the 2010s, written either from a point of view of any of his OCs, in which he claims to be with any of them. Oh, right, yeah, when he was, like, trying to be Magic Channel, something like that. Yeah, okay, now I remember. In the fall of 2017, the Idea Guys roleplayed as Chris's own imaginary friends, giving Chris validation over his pre-existing notions and further fueling his maladaptive behavior, such as by convincing Chris that his imaginary friends will be united with him in the dimensional merge and that he is married to several of them in a polyamorous marriage. Magical thinking. Quite frankly, I believe you are wasting your time. There are no more productive things in life than levitating a pen. Put your energy into those. Magician Uri Geller's advice for Chris, who asks Uri for help training his psychic powers. Chris's response, I am not wasting my time. Yeah. Super. Meanwhile, Chris's habit of magical thinking is another maladaptive coping method, manifesting in delusions of grandeur. Instead of putting in the effort to improve his own life, Chris prefers to believe that magic will do it for him. In addition, he believes that magic will allow him to neutralize his perceived enemies. I intend to do a lot more good with my psychic powers to bring peace and take down up to all of the internet haters and bullies. I need to do all these in my own control. Whatever that means, and how are you going to do that, Chris? Also, Chris believes he has an array of magic powers. Most notably is the ability to curse his enemies, as well as to undo it. Others include communicating with the dead, brainwashing people, and psychic powers. Bollocks, bollocks, and total bollocks. Happy? Moving on. Superstitions. While most of Chris's superstitions are his own, he also takes part in popular superstitions as well. I wish that wasn't a thing that was real, but there you are. Autistic people in general tend to be predisposed to wishful and magical thinking, finding superstitions to be comforting. Chris dislikes the number 13 because he thinks it is an unlucky number. Trichistiophobia, the fear of 13, is already a common American superstition, with Microsoft Office notably skipping version 13 during the development of Office 2010. However, Chris's fear of the number 13 had an unusual effect on the numbering of the Sonic 2 comics, where Sonic 2 issue 13 was numbered as Sonic 2 issue 12-9, showing his incompetency with either logic or math, and where the episode One Lucky Dog from Sonic 2 issue 6 was labelled episode 12.5. On Twitter, when going into multi-tweet rants, Chris numbers the tweets for Twitter messages which exceed 12 tweets. Chris either replaces the number 13 with a repeated 12 or with 12-9. What an absolute moron. Chris has also shown belief in astrology. Fuck me, here we go. He included his and Sarah Hammer's zodiac signs in the life shares. In his OkCupid profile, he wrote that his sign is Pisces and it's fun to think about. He wrote to Jessica Quinn, "I am emotion prone and I tend to do as I feel and life flows like the Pisces I was born under." One of the quotes on his first Facebook was, "I was born under the sign of Pisces, the sign of the provider." Fuck off, Chris. What the hell do you mean provider? What do you provide, Chris? Nothing. That's what you do. "I am fully capable of providing the necessities and then some." What are these, by the way? It's never really been exhibited. "For the lucky woman who loves me for me and becomes my true sweetheart." His belief in star signs may explain why he holds such a high significance to his birthday. Chris places significance on his birthstone, which he calls amethyst. He believes the class ring with the stone is what gives him power, and even pointed it to Emily on their date. More recently, he has attached an amethyst quartz crystal to his medallion. In the real world, science and technology. Technology! I do not even know of the symptoms because, again, if I literally overthought about it, I would be at a greater risk of infecting myself from reading and repeating the list in my mind. It's neurotypical and idiotic for anyone to do that and overthink it. This coming as a result of the rationalization staying ignorant of the viral disease COVID-19. Chris somehow, by the way, stating that he knew about this at the beginning of 2019, but just decided to do nothing about it. Mad. Absolute mad. Chris seems completely unaware of what current technology is and is not capable of. In his Sonic 2 article on the Wikipedia, he suggests that Nintendo pour their resources in developing a Pokeball peripheral that would have slots for every generation of Pokemon games, including a slot for the GameCube memory card. He expects users of this peripheral to be able to read party data from the inserted game/memory card, display a holographic image of the Pokemon in play, and challenge people in the real life who own the same peripheral in a manner much like on Yu-Gi-Oh! In addition, Chris has no idea how everyday machines such as the cars work. Ka-chow. Evidence in how he claimed that a 1997 Cadillac with a cracked engine block would be a great fixer-upper. Normally, any serious physical damage to a car's engine can only be repaired by a very skilled mechanic, or cannot be repaired at all, and one must buy a new engine, both of which are not cheap, but that's an entirely different problem. Or again, you know what you could do? Take out the engine, take out the seats, reupholster them or something like that, or clean them, and sell them off as like furniture. There are people who literally disassemble their cars and literally convert them into living rooms. And that's not even me like being snide or anything like that. I've seen that done as well. They turn like a V8 engine into a coffee table. Just put a bit of glass on top of it, put it on legs, and you're good to go. And there's no shortage of V8 engines in the United States. You know, like a 1989 Chevrolet Camaro RS has I think it's got like a 5.8 litre V8 engine. Produces only 198 horsepower. How, even in 1989, could you get a V8 engine to only produce less than 200 horsepower? I don't know. I really don't know. Chris has also been shown to lack knowledge of basic pathology. Where he contracted a cold in December of 2019, he had misattributed it to the large-scale triggering he got from a number of people on his Twitter. Social rules. Yeah, don't touch people. You know, stuff. Very, small, by degrees will do this. Chris also obsesses over popular rules about relationships. He's held on to the idea that sex should be given on the third date. As you do. As well as other overly generic dating advice. Other rules, like, don't mention the war or anything like that. Other rules Chris has culled from pop culture include superficial platitudes about decency, often expecting them to be valid in situations concerning others he has wronged. To name a specific example, besides empathetically claiming to be true and honest and requesting others forgive and forget, Chris once openly expressed a belief that learning morals about love and friendship from franchises like My Little Pony and Care Bears can prevent war. Considering earlier today, considering like nearly 24 hours ago, at least at the recording of this video, Donald Trump announced he was going to cut all funding towards the Ukrainian war effort because Zelensky refused to play ball. About 18 hours later, Zelensky said, yes, you know what, we'll go with it. And basically, I'm absolutely certain they got that from Discord or they got that from, Pinkie Pie or anything like that. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that will bring... I think it was even Zelensky and Trump were in the same room when Zelensky said, yes, the United States absolutely came together, and Donald Trump, louder Zelensky, the United States and Donald Trump, you know what I mean? Yeah, absolutely, that's something they learned from Care Bears, is that, to bring the war in the Ukraine to an end, yes, I remember that was an episode of, that was taught in an episode of Care Bears, that if somebody doesn't share the same morals as you do, you force them on them and you make life difficult for them until they eventually give in to your demands. Yeah, I must have been out that day when that episode of Care Bears was on. Sorry, where was I? Woefully unaware that the real world and human beings are many times more complex than what is portrayed in a cartoon for young children. Time for a game of disappearing bears. Anyway, conspiracy theories. I bet even Greene County had something to do with influencing that goddamn Michael Snyder to make him pretend to have a reason to kick me out. Well, no. No, Chris, not really. Chris and his parents have come up with several conspiracy theories to explain away his life's problems. Notable examples are Chris blaming his elementary school for keeping him in his autistic shell, his parents' notion that Michael Snyder and Megan Schroeder were masterminds behind the trolls, and Chris's belief that Snyder caused his own injuries when Chris and his mother hit him with their car. Estimation. A car weighs a lot more than 10 tons. Chris being unaware that most cars weigh 2 or 3 tons. Minus passengers, probably. Chris has a tendency to hugely exaggerate estimates of length, weight, and strength in his favour. as evidenced in his description of a 12-pack of canned lemonade as being 50 pounds, or 22.7 kilograms. This behavior is symptomatic of dyscalculia, a common symptom of autism, which leaves the sufferer, well, others, with poor comprehension of time, measurement, or spatial reasoning. However, Chris does not really seem to display any other symptoms of it, suggesting this behavior isn't mere ignorance, but rather Chris telling childish lies to try and impress people with his physical strength. Oh, so don't mind me, guys. I was just trying to look for it, because it's not there. But lack of theory of mind. Chris has no idea on what the billions of people on the planet think. Good. He thinks that all men would happily wear bras and skirts. It must be noted that Chris thought these ideas so that he alone would feel more comfortable cross-dressing, and that every Sonic fan on the planet would support him in his Sonic Boom protests. When somebody informs him that they have a different opinion from him, he throws a tantrum and denounces that person as a troll. While autistic people have long been stereotyped with a lack of theory of mind, research into the double empathy problem proves that they don't necessarily lack it, though Chris definitely does. His actions speak for little, if any. In fact, none at all. Narcissistic tendencies. Chris automatically assumes his lies will be believed. Yeah, that makes sense. Even if they contradict existing information. This is copiously evident in his constant lies during the father call, wherein Chris fibs incessantly about his health, among other things, frequently denying things or changing his story whenever he gets caught out. His habit of lying about his lies is likely inherited from his mother, whom his brother described as a pathological liar. When asked by Evan to remove Simona from his comics, Chris decided that he could have created her without the inspiration of Evan's character, Simonchu, and thus effectively had. The fact that he demonstrably could not have done this did not factor into his reasoning. Chris corrected Simona's Wikipedia entry with a retraction denying that Simona had ever been inspired by Simonchu. Chris expected that this revised version of the truth would be happily accepted by all concerned parties. In addition to lies, Chris expects that any so-called apology will immediately change the minds of any perceived enemy of his, and everything will be sunshine and rainbows for him again. He has done this many times before, but almost always not working out in his favour, especially considering his self-centered temperament and general nonchalant disregard for social etiquette are often what caused him trouble in the first place. Later on, however, he opted for a different approach in the form of contracts, in addition to, unwittingly, invalidating his own contract with a stipulation that store managers cannot hand him over to the police. He proclaimed that refusal to let an individual with a history of belligerent and disruptive behaviour run amok in a retail setting would prove a manager to be most incompassionate and lacking of heart and soul, even accusing them of potential discrimination simply because he identifies as an LGBTQ+ person. Chris considers people like with Asperger's syndrome to be fakers who are taking the shine and limelight away from genuine autistic people such as himself. Although Chris has admitted that this fact is only his own idea, he still believes that to think otherwise is to confirm to blasphemy. However, whatever Chris means by this, as with many other things which antagonize him, Chris simply assumes Asperger's to be signs of a conspiracy targeting himself. Unsurprisingly, Chris can come across as highly delusional when he expects to be taken seriously. I wonder why. For example, on the 28th of April 2012, he made an empty threat to the Kiwi Farms about hunting down each of its members He claimed to know where each of them lived in an attempt to intimidate the trolls. Even if one were to gloss over the fact that he wouldn't even cough up $800 to travel to Redmond to see his dreams come true, and it should be noted that there are trolls all over America, and indeed the world, there's a higher chance that there will only be one outcome of Chris actively pursuing his trolls with the purpose of doing them any harm. All things considered, Chris ended up making himself even more of a laughingstock in the process. Like many of his worst flaws, this contributed to the biggest mess Chris had ever gotten himself into. In July of 2021, Chris felt a need to confide in someone that he was shagging his elderly mom. Wow, this was written by a British person because they actually used the word shag. Get in there. It wasn't me, by the way. After previously lying that he was with an anonymous older woman, for this he chose Bella, foolishly thinking he could trust her to keep the details secret. Despite Chris confessing to this illegal act of incest, having been informed by Noel she's an obvious troll and that he had suffered the consequences of oversharing personal information multiple times for years. Needless to say, this caused a ruckus that ultimately led to Chris getting arrested. And believe it or not, guys, there we are. That was the whole of Chris and reality. So I feel like the only thing I can really add before we part ways once again is that you sort of begin to pick up on the idea that, well, does my theories at the beginning of this video actually hold any weight now that we are at the end of it? Is that Chris actually, more than not, can actually understand, can actually hold some account of reality. It's just that other times he at times he can, but just like with lying, he could tell the truth. It's just more often than not he chooses not to. When it cut now, in terms of what I also said about whether or not Chris is legitimately like ill in the head, to do stuff like that, Chris probably would have had to have succumbed to some sort of like high levels of like therapy, from reality testing to well, it would also lead to things like, you know, Barbara and Bob would probably have to go under some sort of investigation as to whether or not there is something to be said that happened in Chris's childhood that could lead to this sort of outburst. Or if it's nothing to do with Chris's parents, then it would probably have to do with maybe there was some sort of deterioration, that maybe there was something like schizophrenia, or something else was like scrambling his brain left, right, and center. These are the sorts of things that will come into play, and, well, in years to come, when people will still be talking about this till probably the very end of time, or at least the very end of Chris's time. And I suppose, just to leave this off on the sort of right thing, I think it's fair to say, regardless of what the rights and the wrongs are on this, because there are a lot of rights and a lot of wrongs on both sides of the coin, well, at the very least, Chris seems to be better, in 2025, despite the carnage that not only Chris caused, but that a lot of other people have done in their wake. But it doesn't seem to have, like, well, changed that much. But with that being said, I hope all of you guys enjoyed this article, and I'll see all of you guys again in the next video. So take care, and bye-bye for now.